The morning sun cast long shadows across the Oregon wilderness as Sarah Mitchell clutched her worn leather satchel closer to her chest. The stagecoach had broken down 3 miles back, leaving her stranded on the dusty trail that wound through the rugged landscape. Her fellow passengers had chosen to walk back to the last town, but Sarah couldn't abandon her mission. The small settlement of Cedar Ridge needed medical supplies, and as the only person willing to make the dangerous journey through Modoc territory, she pressed forward alone. The year was 1872, and tensions between the Modoc people and white settlers had reached a boiling point. Stories of raids and violence filled every conversation in the towns along the Oregon-California border. Sarah had heard the warnings, seen the fear in people's eyes when she mentioned her destination, but her commitment to helping others outweighed her personal concerns. As a traveling nurse, she had witnessed too much suffering to let fear stop her from delivering medicine that could save lives. The trail ahead disappeared into a grove of ancient pines, their massive trunks creating a cathedral of green shadows. Sarah's boots crunched softly on the pine needles as she entered the grove, her heart beating faster with each step. The silence was absolute, broken only by the whisper of wind through the branches high above. She had been walking for over an hour since the stagecoach incident, and her legs were beginning to ache. Suddenly, a branch snapped somewhere behind her. Sarah froze, her hand instinctively moving to the small pistol hidden in her coat pocket. She turned slowly, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest seemed to hold its breath, waiting. Then she saw him. He emerged from behind a massive pine, trunk like a shadow, given form. Tall and lean, with long black hair that fell past his shoulders, he moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. His dark eyes met hers across the 30 feet that separated them, and Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. She had never seen a Modoc warrior before, but she knew instinctively what she was looking at. He wore traditional buckskin clothing, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught the filtered sunlight. A knife hung at his belt, and he carried a rifle with casual familiarity. His face was painted with red and black designs that made him appear both fierce and otherworldly. But it was his eyes that captured Sarah's attention most. They were intelligent, assessing, and completely unreadable. For what felt like an eternity, neither of them moved. Sarah's mind raced through everything she had been told about encounters with hostile Indians. Run, fight, scream. None of those options seemed viable now. Her legs felt like water, and her throat had closed completely. The warrior studied her with the same intensity she might use to examine a rare species of bird. Then he took a step forward, and Sarah's paralysis broke. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible even to herself. "I'm just trying to help people. I have medicine." She gestured weakly toward her satchel, hoping he might understand. The warrior tilted his head slightly, as if considering her words. He said something in his native language, the syllables flowing like water over stones. When Sarah didn't respond, he tried again in heavily accented English. "You are lost, white woman." It wasn't a question. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. Her hand remained near her pocket, though she knew the small pistol would be useless against someone who could disappear into the forest as easily as breathing. "Where do you go?" the warrior asked, taking another careful step closer. Sarah's instinct screamed at her to run, but something in his voice made her pause. There was no aggression in it, no threat. If anything, he sounded curious. Still, her entire body trembled as she forced herself to answer. "Cedar Ridge," she managed. "There's sickness there. Children are dying." The warrior's expression didn't change, but she thought she saw something flicker in his dark eyes. He was close enough now that she could see the individual beads on his clothing, the scars on his hands. Close enough to strike if he chose to. "My people know this sickness," he said quietly. "It takes the young ones first." Sarah blinked in surprise. She hadn't expected him to know about the outbreak, let alone speak of it with what sounded like genuine concern. The fever that was ravaging Cedar Ridge had appeared suddenly, and the town's doctor had been overwhelmed. That's why they had sent for her, and why she carried precious quinine and other medicines in her satchel. "You've seen it before?" she asked, momentarily forgetting her fear. "2 winters passed, it came to our village." His voice carried a weight of old pain. "Many children went to the spirit world. The medicine man could not help them. The shared experience of loss created an unexpected bridge between them. Sarah found herself looking at him not as a faceless enemy, but as someone who had watched children suffer and die. Someone who understood the urgency that had driven her into dangerous territory. "I have medicine that might help," she said, her voice growing stronger. "But I don't know the way to Cedar Ridge from here." The warrior studied her for a long moment, his gaze moving from her face to her satchel and back again. Sarah held her breath, acutely aware that her fate hung on whatever decision he was making behind those unreadable eyes. "The trail you follow leads to bad water," he said finally. "Many who drink from those streams become sick. Cedar Ridge is 2 days that way." He pointed toward a rocky outcropping to the north. "But the path is hidden, easy to become lost forever." Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. If she was on the wrong trail, she could wander for days without finding the settlement. And if the water sources were contaminated, she risked becoming another casualty of the very disease she was trying to fight. "Is there another way?" she asked. The warrior was quiet for so long that Sarah began to wonder if he had understood her question. When he finally spoke, his words sent a shock through her entire system. "I can show you the safe path." Sarah stared at him in disbelief. This was a Modoc warrior, one of the people her own kind considered savage enemies. Yet he was offering to help her reach a white settlement that might well be planning attacks on his people. It made no sense. "Why?" she whispered. For the first time, something that might have been a smile touched the corners of his mouth. "Because you carry medicine for sick children. And because my grandmother taught me that healing knows no color." The simple honesty in his voice did something unexpected to Sarah's heart. The terror that had gripped her began to transform into something more complex. This man could have killed her, robbed her, left her to die in the wilderness. Instead, he was offering to guide her to safety. But the story she had heard, the warnings, the deep-seated fear of her people toward his, all rose up in her mind like a dark tide. "I'm afraid of you," she whispered, the words escaping before she could stop them. The warrior's expression softened, and he took a deliberate step backward, increasing the distance between them. When he spoke, his voice was gentle, almost apologetic. "Then, I'll earn your trust." The promise hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Sarah found herself looking into his eyes and seeing not the savage enemy of frontier stories, but a man who had known loss, who understood suffering, and who chose compassion over conflict. "My name is Sarah," she said quietly, taking the first tentative step across that bridge. He nodded solemnly, as if she had offered him a great gift. "I am Kintwash. My people call me Captain Jack, but that is the white man's name for me." Sarah had heard that name whispered in the settlements, always with fear. Captain Jack, the Modoc war leader who had defied the government's attempts to force his people onto a reservation. The man standing before her was a legend, a figure of both terror and respect on the frontier. But looking at him now, she saw something the stories had never mentioned. She saw kindness. "Will you really help me reach Cedar Ridge?" she asked. "The path is dangerous for one who does not know the land," Kintwash replied. "There are places where the earth gives way, where mountain cats hunt, where men of bad heart sometimes wait for travelers. But I know the safe way." The practical part of Sarah's mind recognized the wisdom of accepting his offer. Without guidance, she might never reach Cedar Ridge alive, let alone in time to help the sick children. But another part of her, the part raised on stories of Indian raids and massacres, recoiled from the idea of trusting her life to this man. Kintwash seemed to sense her internal struggle. "You think I will harm you?" he said matter-of-factly. "I don't know what to think," Sarah admitted. "I've been told terrible things about your people." "And what terrible things have you been told about yours?" he asked quietly. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. She thought about the stories she had heard from Indian survivors of raids by white settlers, of broken treaties and forced relocations. She remembered the haunted eyes of the few peaceful Indians she had treated in her work, the way they flinched when white men approached. "You have a point," she said softly. "We each carry the stories our people tell us," Kintwash said. "But stories are not always truth. And truth is not always what we expect." He gestured toward the path ahead. "I will walk far in front, so you do not fear. When we stop to rest, I will stay distant. At night, I will keep watch from where you cannot see me. You will be safe, white medicine woman. This I promise." The formal way he addressed her, the respect in his tone, touched something deep in Sarah's heart. This man owed her nothing. If anything, his people had every reason to hate hers. Yet he was willing to risk his own safety to help her save lives in a white settlement. "Why do you call me medicine woman?" she asked. "It is what you are," he replied simply. "One who carries healing. Among my people, such a person is honored." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes. In her own society, she was often looked down upon for her choice to work as a traveling nurse. Proper ladies didn't venture into dangerous territory or tend to the sick without male supervision. But this warrior saw her calling as something worthy of honor. "Thank you," she whispered. Kemp Wash nodded and turned toward the northern path. "We should travel while the sun is high. The medicine you carry is needed." As they began walking, Sarah found herself studying her unexpected guide. He moved through the forest with an economy of motion that spoke of years of wilderness living. His eyes constantly scanned their surroundings, alert for any sign of danger. Despite his assurances, she noticed he positioned himself to shield her from the most vulnerable directions. The path he led her on was indeed hidden. Without his guidance, she would never have noticed the subtle game trail that wound between massive boulders and around steep ravines. Several times they passed water sources that looked clean and inviting, but Kemp Wash would shake his head and lead her to other streams that seemed identical, but were, according to him, safe to drink. As the day progressed, Sarah found her initial terror gradually being replaced by cautious respect. Kemp Wash kept his promise to maintain distance, never approaching closer than 30 feet unless the terrain demanded it. When they rested, he would position himself where she could see him, but where he posed no apparent threat. He seemed to understand that trust would come slowly, and he was willing to earn it through actions rather than words. By evening, they had covered more ground than Sarah would have managed alone in 2 days. Kemp Wash led her to a sheltered spot near a clear stream, surrounded by large rocks that would provide both concealment and protection from the wind. "You rest here," he said, indicating a flat area between two boulders. "I will be near, but you will not see me." "Wait," Sarah called as he turned to leave. "Don't you need to eat?" "To rest." A ghost of a smile crossed his face. "The forest provides for those who know her secrets." "Sleep, medicine woman. Tomorrow we reach the valley where Cedar Ridge lies." As Kemp Wash disappeared into the darkening forest with the same silent grace he had shown all day, Sarah found herself alone with her thoughts for the first time since their encounter. The events of the day seemed surreal, like something from a dream or a story told around a campfire. This morning, she had been a frightened white woman traveling through hostile Indian territory. Tonight, she was under the protection of one of the most feared war leaders on the frontier, and she felt safer than she had in days. The realization shook her to her core. Everything she had been taught about Indians, about the nature of the conflict on the frontier, was being challenged by the actions of one man. Kemp Wash had shown her more courtesy and protection than many white men she had encountered in her travels. As she settled down for the night, Sarah found herself listening to the sounds of the forest. Somewhere in the darkness, Kemp Wash was keeping watch, ensuring her safety even as she slept. The thought filled her with a complex mixture of gratitude and confusion that would follow her into her dreams. Sarah woke to the soft sound of someone moving nearby. For a moment, panic gripped her as she remembered where she was and who she was with. Then she saw Kemp Wash crouched by the stream, his back to her, washing something in the clear water. He was exactly where he had promised to be, close enough to protect her, far enough away to respect her space. The morning air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and mountain flowers. Sarah sat up slowly, working the stiffness from her back after a night spent on hard ground. Despite her uncomfortable sleeping arrangements, she had slept better than she had in days. The constant anxiety that had plagued her since entering Indian territory had somehow lifted during the night. Kemp Wash must have heard her stirring because he stood and walked a respectful distance away from the stream before turning to face her. "Good morning, medicine woman," he said quietly. "The water is sweet here. You may drink safely." Sarah approached the stream cautiously, still not entirely comfortable with his presence, but no longer terrified. As she knelt to cup water in her hands, she caught sight of what Kemp Wash had been washing. Several trout lay cleaned and ready on a flat rock, their silver scales catching the morning sunlight. "You caught these?" she asked, impressed despite herself. "The stream speaks to those who listen," he replied simply. "Your body needs strength for the journey ahead." The casual way he provided for her, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, stirred something unexpected in Sarah's chest. When was the last time someone had taken care of her needs without being asked? In her work as a traveling nurse, she was always the one caring for others, anticipating their needs, sacrificing her own comfort for their well-being. "I don't have anything to offer in return," she said, feeling awkward about accepting his gift. Kintwash studied her with those dark, intelligent eyes. "You travel far from safety to bring healing to children you have never seen. This is gift enough." His words touched her deeply. Most people saw her medical missions as foolish risks taken by a woman who didn't know her proper place. But Kintwash saw the heart of what she did, the calling to heal that drove her beyond the boundaries of safety and convention. They ate the fish in companionable silence, Kintwash maintaining his respectful distance while ensuring Sarah had her fill. The food was perfectly cooked over a small, smokeless fire he had built while she slept. As they prepared to continue their journey, Sarah found herself studying this man who had turned her world upside down in less than 24 hours. Everything about him contradicted the stories she had heard. He was gentle where she had expected savagery, thoughtful where she had expected mindless violence, protective where she had expected threat. The disconnect between reality and reputation puzzled her deeply. "May I ask you something?" she said as they set out on the trail. Kintwash nodded, his attention divided between her question and the constant monitoring of their surroundings that seemed second nature to him. "The stories I've heard about you, about Captain Jack, they paint a very different picture than what I'm seeing." A shadow crossed his face, and for a moment Sarah wondered if she had overstepped some invisible boundary. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. "Stories grow in the telling, like shadows grow longer as the sun sets." "What stories do you know of me?" Sarah hesitated, reluctant to repeat tales that now seemed cruel and unfair. "They say you're a ruthless war leader, that you've killed many white settlers, that you can't be trusted. And do you believe these stories now?" The question hung between them as they navigated a particularly steep section of trail. Sarah considered her words carefully, aware that her answer mattered more than mere politeness. "I don't know what to believe anymore," she said honestly. "The man walking beside me doesn't match the stories." Kintwash was quiet for so long that Sarah began to think he wouldn't respond. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I have killed," he said simply, "when my people were attacked, when my family was threatened, when there was no other choice. But I have never killed for pleasure or from hatred. Every death weighs on my spirit." The raw honesty in his confession struck Sarah like a physical blow. This was not the boastful bragging of a savage warrior, but the quiet pain of a man who had done terrible things for necessary reasons. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I shouldn't have asked. Truth should not require apology," Kintwash replied. "You have the right to know who guides you." They walked in silence for a while, each lost in their own thoughts. The trail wound higher into the mountains, offering spectacular views of the wilderness stretching endlessly in all directions. Sarah had traveled many rugged places in her work, but she had never seen anything quite like this harsh, beautiful landscape. As they crested a ridge, Kintwash suddenly raised his hand, signaling her to stop. His entire posture changed, becoming alert and tense. Sarah's heart jumped as he motioned for her to crouch behind a large boulder. "What is it?" she whispered. "Riders," he replied quietly. "White men, armed." Sarah peered around the boulder and saw them, 4 men on horseback riding up the valley below. Even from a distance, she could see the rifles they carried and the hard set of their faces. These were not friendly travelers. "Are they looking for us?" she asked, though she already suspected the answer. Kintwash's expression was grim. "They hunt for me. There is a price on my head in the white settlements. Much gold for the man who brings in Captain Jack." The casual way he mentioned the bounty on his life sent a chill through Sarah. She realized suddenly how much danger Kintwash was putting himself in by helping her. Not only was he risking an encounter with hostile settlers, he was doing it to help her reach a white settlement that might well contribute to that bounty. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. "Would it have changed your need for guidance?" The simple question made Sarah confront an uncomfortable truth. She would have taken his help regardless, because without it she would almost certainly die in the wilderness. But knowing about the bounty would have added another layer of guilt to her already complex feelings about their arrangement. The riders passed below without spotting them, but the encounter cast a shadow over the rest of the morning's travel. Sarah found herself hyper-aware of every sound, every movement in the forest around them. She also found herself looking at Kintwash with new eyes. This man was risking his life to help her, and she had offered him nothing but suspicion and fear in return. The inequality of the exchange troubled her deeply. As they stopped to rest at midday, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. "When we reach Cedar Ridge," she said, "you should come with me into the settlement." Kintwash looked at her as if she had suggested they fly to the moon. "I'm not welcome in white towns, medicine woman." "You would be under my protection," Sarah insisted. "As a medical professional, I have some authority. I could vouch for you." The look Kintwash gave her was both touched and sad. "Your people would not listen to such vouching. And if they discovered who I am, then don't tell them who you are. You could be my guide, someone I hired to help me through the wilderness. You would lie for me." The question forced Sarah to examine her own motivations. Why was she so determined to protect this man? Was it gratitude for his help? Guilt over the injustices his people had suffered? Or was it something deeper, more personal? "I would tell them the truth," she said finally. "That you saved my life and helped me bring medicine to their children. That should count for something." Kintwash studied her face intently, as if searching for some hidden meaning in her words. "You do not understand the hatred your people have for mine. It is not rational. It does not respond to good deeds or kindness. Maybe it's time someone tried to change that." The words came out more forcefully than Sarah had intended, surprising them both. She hadn't realized until that moment how angry she was becoming about the situation. Here was a good man, someone who had shown her nothing but kindness and protection, and he couldn't walk safely into a white settlement because of prejudice and fear. "You have a good heart, medicine woman," Kintwash said gently, "but some walls are too high to climb." They resumed their journey in thoughtful silence, but Sarah's mind kept returning to their conversation. She began to notice things about Kintwash that she had missed before. The way he moved aside branches so they wouldn't snap back and hit her, how he always made sure she had the easiest path when the trail forked. The careful way he watched her for signs of fatigue without making her feel weak or incapable. This was not the behavior of a savage or an enemy. This was the behavior of a gentleman, more courteous and considerate than many of the supposedly civilized men she had encountered in her travels. As the afternoon wore on, they began to descend into a valley that Kintwash told her contained Cedar Ridge. Sarah felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety as they approached their destination. She was eager to begin helping the sick children, but she was also increasingly reluctant to part ways with her unexpected companion. "Tell me about your people," she said as they walked. "About your family." Kintwash glanced at her, perhaps surprised by the personal nature of her question. "What would you know?" "Everything," Sarah said impulsively. "I want to understand." For the next hour, as they made their way down into the valley, Kintwash shared pieces of his life with her. He spoke of his wife, a woman named Riddle who had died in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers 2 years earlier. He described his younger sister, who had a gift for healing with herbs, and his elderly grandfather, who remembered when white men first came to Modoc lands. The picture he painted was not of a savage tribe, but of a complex society with its own customs, values, and struggles. He talked about the seasonal migrations his people had made for generations, following the rhythms of nature and the availability of game and plants. He described ceremonies and celebrations, the training of young warriors, the wisdom of the elders. "We are not so different, your people and mine," he concluded. "We love our children, honor our elders, grieve for our dead. We want to live in peace and provide for our families." "Then why is there so much conflict?" Sarah asked. Kintwash was quiet for a long moment, choosing his words carefully. "Your people want land that is ours. They make promises they do not keep. They see us as obstacles to be removed, not as human beings with rights to the places our ancestors are buried." The sadness in his voice was unmistakable, and Sarah felt a sharp pang of guilt for the actions of her own people. She had never considered the conflict from an Indian perspective before, had never thought about what it meant to have strangers claim your ancestral homeland as their own. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, "for what my people have done to yours. You're not responsible for the actions of others," Kintwash replied. "But your words show a good heart." As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, they finally caught sight of Cedar Ridge. The settlement was larger than Sarah had expected, with perhaps 50 buildings spread across a flat area, beside a rapid stream. Smoke rose from chimneys, and she could see people moving about their daily business. But even from a distance, something seemed wrong. There were too few people visible, and those she could see moved slowly, without the energy of a healthy community. "The sickness is bad here," Kimpwash observed, his keen eyes picking up the same details that had caught Sarah's attention. "Then, I arrived just in time," Sarah said, checking her satchel to make sure the precious medical supplies were secure. They had stopped on a hill overlooking the settlement, and Sarah realized this would be where they parted ways. The thought filled her with unexpected sadness. Over the course of their journey together, Kimpwash had become more than just a guide. He had become a friend, perhaps the truest friend she had ever known. "I wish you could come with me," she said softly. "And I wish your people could see you as I do," Kimpwash replied. "You bring light to dark places, medicine woman. Do not let the hatred of others dim that light." Sarah felt tears welling in her eyes. In 2 days, this man had seen and valued her true nature more clearly than people who had known her for years. The unfairness of their situation, that prejudice and hatred would force them apart when they had found such unexpected connection, overwhelmed her. "Will I see you again?" she asked. Kimpwash looked down at the settlement, then back at her. "When your work is finished, if you wish it, I will guide you safely back to the stagecoach road." "I would like that very much," Sarah said, meaning it more than she had ever meant anything in her life. "Then I will watch for your signal. When you are ready to leave, light a fire on this hill at sunset. I will see it and come to you." With that arrangement made, there was nothing left but the goodbye neither of them wanted to say. Finally, Kimpwash stepped closer than he had been since their first meeting and spoke with quiet intensity. "Be careful in that place, medicine woman. Not all dangers come from the wilderness. Some hide behind civilized faces." Before Sarah could ask what he meant, Kimpwash had melted back into the forest as silently as he had first appeared. She stood alone on the hill, looking down at Cedar Ridge and feeling more isolated than she ever had in her life. But she carried with her something precious, the knowledge that goodness and honor could be found in the most unexpected places, and that the walls between peoples were built from ignorance and fear rather than genuine incompatibility. As she made her way down the hill toward the settlement and the work that awaited her there, Sarah held that knowledge close to her heart like a flame against the gathering darkness. The main street of Cedar Ridge was eerily quiet as Sarah walked toward the cluster of buildings that made up the settlement's heart. A few people moved about their business, but they walked with the careful, measured steps of those conserving strength. The air itself seemed heavy with illness and worry. A weathered sign identified the largest building as Miller's General Store, and Sarah headed toward it, hoping to find someone who could direct her to wherever the sick were being treated. As she approached, a man emerged from the building, tall, broad-shouldered, with graying hair and suspicious eyes that immediately fixed on her travel-stained appearance. "You lost, miss?" he asked, his tone suggesting that strangers were not particularly welcome in Cedar Ridge. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, a traveling nurse," she replied, straightening her shoulders despite her fatigue. "I was sent from Sacramento with medical supplies. I understand there's been an outbreak of fever here." The man's entire demeanor changed at her words. Relief washed across his weathered features, and he stepped forward eagerly. "Thank the Lord," he said. "I'm Tom Miller, and this is my store. We've been waiting and praying for help to come. The sickness, it's been terrible. Dr. Hayes has been doing what he can, but we lost little Emma Thompson yesterday, and the Carlson boy isn't expected to last the night." Sarah felt the familiar tightening in her chest that came with hearing about children in danger. This was why she had risked the dangerous journey, why she had pushed forward despite broken stagecoaches and treacherous wilderness. "Where are the sick being treated?" she asked, adjusting her medical bag. "Doc Hayes set up a clinic in the old church at the end of the street. Most of the bad cases are there. The others are being cared for at home," but Miller's voice trailed off, and Sarah could see the exhaustion in his eyes. This was a community pushed to its limits by crisis. "How long has this been going on?" 3 weeks now. Started with the Hendricks family. They live up near the creek. Within days, it spread to half the children in town. We sent word out for help, but you're the first to make it through." Sarah nodded grimly. 3 weeks was a long time for a fever outbreak to rage unchecked. Every day of delay meant more lives at risk, more families destroyed by loss. "I'll need to see Dr. Hayes immediately," she said. "And I'll need to assess the patients to determine the best use of the medicines I've brought. Miller led her through the dusty streets, pointing out houses where families were caring for sick children at home. Sarah made mental notes of each location, already beginning to formulate a treatment plan in her mind. The church that had been converted into a makeshift clinic was a modest wooden structure with a bell tower that pointed hopefully toward the sky. As they approached, Sarah could hear the sound of crying, both children and adults, drifting through the open windows. Inside, the scene was heartbreaking. Roughly 20 people, mostly children, lay on makeshift beds arranged in rows down the center aisle. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. A gray-haired man in shirt sleeves moved between the patients, checking temperatures and offering what comfort he could. "Doc Hayes," Miller called. "This is the nurse from Sacramento. She's brought medicine." Dr. Hayes looked up, and Sarah saw on his face the bone-deep weariness of a man who had been fighting a losing battle for too long. He was perhaps 60 years old, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles and hands that shook slightly from exhaustion. "Miss Mitchell," he said, walking toward her with obvious relief. "I can't tell you how grateful I am that you've come. I've done everything I know how to do, but this fever, it's unlike anything I've seen before." Sarah set down her medical bag and began unpacking supplies, her professional instincts taking over. "Tell me about the symptoms, doctor. When did you first notice the pattern?" For the next hour, Dr. Hayes briefed her on the outbreak while Sarah examined patients and assessed the situation. The fever typically began with headaches and body aches, progressed to high temperatures and delirium, and in the worst cases led to a distinctive rash and rapid deterioration. As she worked, Sarah became aware of something that made her increasingly uncomfortable. Several times, she caught Miller and other townspeople watching her with expressions that seemed oddly suspicious. When she asked Dr. Hayes about it privately, his answer chilled her. "There's been talk," he said quietly. "Some folks think the outbreak isn't natural. They're looking for someone to blame, and strangers, well, strangers make easy targets. Surely they don't think I brought the sickness with me? No, not you. But there have been rumors about the Indians. Some people think the Modoc might have poisoned the water supply or used some kind of native curse." Dr. Hayes shook his head in frustration. Nonsense, of course, but fear makes people look for simple explanations to complex problems. Sarah felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She thought about Kintwash, waiting somewhere in the forest around the settlement, and realized that his warnings about the dangers of civilized faces had been more prescient than she had understood. "Has anyone seen Indians near the settlement recently?" she asked, trying to keep her voice casual. "Old Pete Jackson claims he spotted someone watching the town from the hills last week, but Pete sees Indians behind every tree. Most likely it was just a deer or his own imagination." Sarah nodded, but her mind was racing. If someone had spotted Kintwash, and if the townspeople were already looking for someone to blame for the outbreak, the combination could be deadly. She threw herself into her work with renewed urgency, not just to save the sick children, but to complete her mission and get away from Cedar Ridge before suspicions could crystallize into action. The quinine she had brought was indeed effective against the fever, and by evening several patients were showing marked improvement. As she worked late into the night, Sarah found herself thinking constantly about Kintwash. She wondered where he was, whether he was safe, whether he was still planning to escort her back to civilization when her work was done. The thought of him filled her with a mixture of gratitude, concern, and something else she wasn't ready to name. The next morning brought both good news and bad. 3 more patients had broken their fevers during the night, including the Carlson boy who had been near death. But Tom Miller approached Sarah with a grim expression that suggested new troubles. "Miss Mitchell," he said quietly, drawing her aside, "there's been some talk among the men about the timing of your arrival, about how you knew to come here when communications are so difficult." Sarah felt ice form in her stomach. "What kind of talk?" "Some folks are wondering how you managed to make it through Indian territory safely, wondering if maybe you had help." The implications were clear and terrifying. If the townspeople suspected she had been traveling with Indians, both she and Kintwash would be in mortal danger. "Mr. Miller," she said carefully, "I came here to help sick children. I brought medicine that is saving lives. Surely that speaks to my intentions." "Of course, miss. I don't doubt your good intentions. But feelings are running high, and people are scared. They're looking for answers for someone to blame. And where they found tracks near the creek this morning. What tracks? Unshod horse prints. Moccasin marks. Someone was definitely watching the town, and recently. Sarah's heart sank. Kimpwash had promised to watch for her signal, which meant he was indeed somewhere nearby. If the townspeople organized a search party, they might find him. I need to focus on treating the patients, she said firmly. Spreading rumors and fear won't help anyone recover faster. Miller nodded, but she could see the doubt in his eyes. You're right, of course. But, Miss Mitchell, if there's anything you want to tell us, anything that might help explain things, now would be the time. The implied threat was unmistakable. Sarah realized she was walking a tightrope. One false step, and both she and Kimpwash could be caught in the hysteria that seemed to be building in the settlement. That afternoon, while Dr. Hayes was resting and Sarah was tending to patients alone, a young woman approached her. She was perhaps 20 years old, with worried eyes and a baby in her arms. Miss Mitchell, the woman said quietly, I'm Mary Hendricks. My family, we were the first to get sick. Sarah looked up from the child she was examining. How are you feeling now? Is your baby all right? We're better, thanks to your medicine. But I need to tell you something about how the sickness started. The urgency in the woman's voice caught Sarah's attention. She glanced around to make sure they weren't being overheard, then gestured for Mary to continue. My husband found a dead deer upstream from where we get our water. It had been there for days, maybe weeks, rotting in the creek. That's what made us sick, the poison water. But when people started talking about Indian curses and such, we didn't say anything. We were scared they'd blame us for not reporting the dead animal sooner. Sarah stared at the young woman, processing the implications of what she was hearing. You're telling me the outbreak has a completely natural cause? Yes, ma'am. And I think you should know that my husband saw an Indian man near the creek a few days ago. But the man wasn't poisoning anything. He was pulling that dead deer out of the water. The world seemed to stop spinning for a moment. Sarah realized that Kimpwash had likely discovered the source of the contamination and tried to clean it up, putting himself at risk to help people who would kill him if they discovered his presence. Why are you telling me this? Sarah asked. Because the talk in town is getting ugly. And because I think you might know something about that Indian man. The way you've been acting, the way you keep looking toward the hills. I think he helped you get here safely. Sarah studied Mary's face, trying to judge whether this was a trap or a genuine attempt to help. The young woman's expression was earnest and worried, with no trace of the suspicion she had seen in others. If I didn't know something, Sarah said carefully, what would you do about it? Nothing, Mary said firmly. If that man helped clean up the water and helped you bring medicine to our children, then he's no enemy of mine. But others won't see it that way. The men are talking about organizing a hunting party. The confirmation of Sarah's worst fears hit her like a physical blow. She had to warn Kimpwash somehow, had to get him away from the area before the vigilantes found him. When? She asked urgently. Tomorrow morning, if they can get enough men together. They're planning to search the hills systematically. Sarah's mind raced. She needed to complete the medical treatment tonight. Several patients still needed another dose of quinine to ensure their recovery. But she also needed to warn Kimpwash before it was too late. Mary, she said quietly, if you really want to help, I need you to do something for me. Can you assist Dr. Hayes with the patients for a few hours tonight? I need to take care of something. Of course. And Miss Mitchell, be careful. There are men in this town who would shoot first and ask questions later if they thought they were protecting their families. As evening fell, Sarah made her preparations carefully. She told Dr. Hayes she needed to check on some of the patients being treated at home, which was partly true, but her real destination was the hill overlooking the settlement, where she planned to light the signal fire that would bring Kimpwash to her. The night air was cold and sharp as she made her way up the hillside, carrying a small bundle of kindling and the material she would need to start fire. Behind her, the lights of Cedar Ridge twinkled peacefully, giving no hint of the violence being planned for the morning. As she reached the crest of the hill, Sarah realized she was probably saying goodbye to the safety of her old world. By choosing to warn Kimpwash, she was crossing a line that would forever change how she saw herself and her place in the conflict between whites and Indians. But as she struck the match that would light the signal fire, Sarah felt no doubt about her choice. Some things were more important than the safety of remaining neutral. Some people were worth the risk of standing up for what was right. The flames caught quickly, sending a bright beacon into the darkness. Somewhere in the forest below, Kintwash would see it and know that she was calling for him. Sarah only hoped she could warn him in time to prevent a tragedy that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Sarah waited by the dying embers of her signal fire, her heart pounding with each passing minute. The night seemed to stretch endlessly around her, filled with the sounds of wilderness that had become familiar during her journey with Kintwash. An owl called somewhere in the darkness below, and she found herself hoping it was actually him, signaling his approach. When he finally appeared, it was with the same silent grace that had marked their first encounter. One moment she was alone on the hillside. The next he was there beside her, his dark eyes reflecting concern as he took in her obvious distress. "Medicine woman," he said quietly, "you signal for help, but your work in the settlement is not finished. Are you in danger?" "Not me," Sarah said urgently, reaching out to touch his arm before catching herself. "You are. They know someone has been watching the town. They found tracks. Tomorrow morning they plan to hunt for you." Kintwash's expression didn't change, but she saw his hand move instinctively toward the knife at his belt. "How many men?" "I don't know exactly. Maybe a dozen, maybe more. They're scared and angry and looking for someone to blame for the sickness." Sarah paused, then added softly, "Mary Hendricks told me what you did. How you tried to clean the dead deer from their water source." For the first time since she had known him, Kintwash looked surprised. "The white woman saw me. Her husband did. But she understands what you were doing. She knows you were trying to help, not harm." Sarah moved closer, lowering her voice even though they were alone on the hilltop. "You have to leave this area tonight. Go far away and don't come back." Kintwash studied her face in the dim light from the dying fire. "And you? How will you travel safely back to your people?" The question caught Sarah off guard. In her urgency to warn him, she hadn't fully considered her own situation. If she left Cedar Ridge now, before all the patients had fully recovered, she would be abandoning her medical duty. But if she stayed to complete her work, she would have to face the return journey alone through wilderness she didn't know. "I'll manage," she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "The important thing is keeping you safe." What? The simple question hit her like a physical blow. Why was she risking her own safety to protect a man she had known for only a few days? Why did the thought of harm coming to him fill her with panic that went far beyond normal human compassion? "Because it will be wrong," she said finally. "Because you've done nothing but help people, and they want to kill you for it. Because—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence that would have revealed too much about the feelings she was only beginning to understand herself. Kintwash was quiet for a long moment, his gaze never leaving her face. When he spoke, his voice was gentle but firm. "I will not run and leave you to face the return journey alone. If I leave this place, you come with me." "I can't. There are still patients who need treatment, children whose fevers haven't fully broken. If I leave now, if you stay, you put yourself in danger from your own people," Kintwash interrupted. "I have seen this before, medicine woman. When fear takes hold of a community, anyone who seems different, anyone who challenges their beliefs, becomes a target." Sarah wanted to argue, but deep down she knew he was right. Her strange arrival, her inexplicable knowledge of the safe route through Indian territory, her obvious concern for his welfare, all of it would make her suspect in the eyes of people desperate to find someone to blame. "What are you suggesting?" she asked. "Come with me now. We will travel to a place where my people have a winter camp. There you can continue your healing work among those who will honor you for it." The offer was tempting, more tempting than Sarah cared to admit. The thought of leaving behind the suspicion and fear of Cedar Ridge, of practicing medicine among people who truly valued healing, of continuing to learn from Kintwash about a way of life so different from her own, it called to something deep in her soul. But her conscience wouldn't let her abandon patients who still needed her care. "I need one more day," she said, "to make sure the children who are still recovering get their final doses of quinine. After that, it may be too late for both of us," Kintwash said. "The hunting party will search tomorrow. If they find my tracks leading to this hill, they will know someone from the settlement warned me. You will be as hunted as I am." The truth of his words settled over Sarah like a cold blanket. She had crossed an invisible line when she decided to warn him, and there might be no going back to her old life. "Then, we need to make sure they don't find your tracks," she said with sudden determination. "Can you get back to wherever you've been hiding without leaving a trail they can follow?" A ghost of a smile touched Kintwash's lips. I am Modoc, medicine woman. We leave no trails unless we choose to. Then, go back to your hiding place and wait. Tomorrow evening, after I've given the final treatments, I'll signal again. But not from here, somewhere else where the tracks won't lead back to the settlement. And if you're discovered, if they realize what you were planning. Sarah took a deep breath, fully accepting the magnitude of what she was choosing. Then, we'll face that together when it comes. The intensity in Kintwash's gaze as he looked at her made Sarah's heart race. There was admiration there, and gratitude, and something else that made her feel like the most important person in the world. You would leave your people for mine? He asked quietly. I would leave fear and hatred for wisdom and compassion, Sarah replied. The color of skin doesn't matter when children are dying. Kintwash reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, and gently touched her face. It was the first time he had deliberately made physical contact with her, and the warmth of his hand against her cheek sent shock waves through her entire body. You have the heart of a true healer, he said softly. My grandmother would have loved you. Before Sarah could respond, he was gone, disappearing into the darkness as silently as he had arrived. She stood alone on the hill, touching her cheek where his hand had been, and realized that in a few short days this man had changed everything about how she saw the world and her place in it. The walk back to Cedar Ridge felt like a journey between two different lives. Behind her was the hill where she had made her choice to stand with Kintwash against whatever consequences might follow. Ahead was a settlement full of people who would consider that choice a betrayal of everything they believed in. Dr. Hayes was dozing in a chair beside one of the sickest patients when Sarah quietly entered the makeshift clinic. He woke as she approached, blinking in confusion. Sarah, where have you been? I was worried when I couldn't find you. I was checking on the families caring for patients at home, she said, the lie coming more easily than she had expected. How are things here? Better, thanks to your medicines. Young Timothy Carlson sat up and asked for water an hour ago. I think the worst is over for most of them. Sarah felt a surge of satisfaction despite her other worries. This was why she had become a nurse, why she risked dangerous journeys to remote settlements. The knowledge that her skills and medicines had saved lives made every hardship worthwhile. She spent the next few hours moving among the patients, checking temperatures, and adjusting treatments. Several more children showed signs of improvement, and by dawn she was confident that the crisis had passed. But as the sun rose over Cedar Ridge, Sarah could see men gathering in small groups throughout the settlement. Tom Miller was moving from house to house, clearly organizing something. The hunting party Kintwash had warned her about was taking shape. Dr. Hayes noticed her attention to the activity outside. They're planning to search for the Indian who's been spotted around here, he explained. Foolish, if you ask me. Even if they find someone, what proof do they have that he caused the outbreak? But grief and fear make people do irrational things. Indeed they do, Sarah murmured, watching Tom Miller point toward the hills where Kintwash was hidden. As the morning progressed, Sarah found it increasingly difficult to concentrate on her medical duties. Every time she looked out the window, she could see armed men preparing for their hunt. Some carried rifles, others had ropes that could only be intended for one purpose. Mary Hendricks appeared at her elbow around midday, her baby in her arms, and worry etched on her face. They're leaving soon, she whispered. 20 men, all armed. Miss Mitchell, if your friend is out there. He's not my friend, Sarah said automatically, then realized how hollow the denial sounded. That is, I don't know what you mean. Mary gave her a look that was both sympathetic and knowing. I've seen how you watch the hills. I've seen the worry in your eyes. Whoever he is, you care about him. And if he really did help you get here safely, then he deserves better than what those men have planned. The young woman's understanding touched Sarah deeply, but it also drove home the danger of her situation. If Mary could see through her pretenses so easily, how long before others did the same? What would you do? Sarah asked quietly. If you were in my position, I'd follow my heart, Mary replied simply. Life's too short, and hard out here to waste time on what other people think is proper. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses and men's voices outside. Through the window, Sarah could see the hunting party mounting up, checking weapons, and pointing toward different areas they planned to search. Tom Miller's voice carried clearly across the settlement as he addressed his men. We know there's at least one hostile in these hills, maybe more. They've been watching our town, and it's only a matter of time before they attack. We're going to find them before they have that chance. Sarah felt sick listening to the hatred in his voice, the eager anticipation of violence from men who had probably never seen a hostile Indian in their lives. These were good men, family men, driven by fear into planning murder. As the hunting party rode out of town, Sarah made her final decision. She couldn't wait until evening to signal Kempwash. The danger was too immediate, too real. She had to warn him now, before the searchers got too close to wherever he was hiding. "Dr. Hayes," she said, approaching the older man with carefully controlled urgency. "I need to check on something at the Hendricks place. They were the first family affected, and I want to make sure the contamination source has been properly dealt with." It wasn't entirely a lie. She did need to go to the Hendricks place, but not for the reason she was giving. According to Mary, the dead deer had been found upstream from their property, which meant that was where Kempwash had been trying to clean up the water source. If she could find evidence of what he had done, it might provide proof of his good intentions. Dr. Hayes nodded absently, his attention focused on a patient whose breathing had become labored during the night. "Of course. Just be careful, Sarah. With all the excitement about Indians in the area, people are jumpy. Make sure everyone knows who you are before you approach." The irony of his warning wasn't lost on Sarah as she gathered her medical bag and headed out of the settlement. She was probably the only person in Cedar Ridge who actually knew there was an Indian in the area, and she was risking everything to protect him from her own people. The Hendricks place was a modest farm about a mile upstream from the main settlement. Sarah had visited twice during her time in Cedar Ridge, treating family members who had been slow to recover from the initial infection. As she approached the small cabin, she could see Mary working in the garden behind the house. "Miss Mitchell," Mary called, straightening up from her plants. "What brings you out here? Is everything all right?" "I wanted to see the place where the dead deer was found," Sarah said, "to make sure the water source is truly clean now." Mary wiped her hands on her apron and gestured toward the creek that ran behind their property. "It's about a quarter-mile upstream. Jake showed me the place after we figured out what had made us sick." As they walked toward the creek, Mary glanced around nervously. "The hunting party rode past here about an hour ago. They were asking if we'd seen any signs of Indians. I told them no, which was true. We haven't seen anyone." But as they reached the creek, Sarah did see signs, not of Indians, but of someone who cared enough about the health of strangers to risk his own safety trying to help them. The area where the deer had rotted was clean now, with rocks arranged to direct the water flow around the contaminated spot. Someone had even built a small dam upstream to create a settling pool where debris could collect instead of flowing down to the settlement. "He did all this?" Mary asked in amazement, seeing the same evidence Sarah had spotted. "It looks like he tried to prevent any more contamination," Sarah confirmed. "This is the work of someone who understands water systems and cares about preventing disease." A rifle shot echoed through the hills in the distance, followed by shouts. Both women looked up in alarm, straining to hear what was happening. "They found something," Mary whispered. Sarah's heart clenched with fear. If the hunting party had found Kempwash, if those shots had been aimed at him, she realized she was running before she had consciously decided to move, following the sound of the disturbance deeper into the wilderness. "Miss Mitchell," Mary called after her. "It's not safe." But Sarah was already beyond hearing, driven by a terror she had never experienced before. The thought of losing Kempwash, of him dying because she had failed to warn him in time, was unbearable. As she ran through the forest, following the distant sounds of men and horses, Sarah finally acknowledged the truth she had been avoiding. She wasn't just trying to save an innocent man from an unjust fate. She was trying to save the person who had become the most important thing in her world, the man she was falling in love with, whether it made sense or not. Sarah ran through the forest with desperate urgency, her medical bag bouncing against her side as she followed the sounds of shouting men and horses. Branches tore at her dress and scratched her face, but she barely noticed. The only thing that mattered was reaching Kempwash before something terrible happened. The voices grew louder as she climbed a steep ridge, and finally, she could make out words through the chaos. "Over here. I found something. Careful, boys. Could be a trap. Look at this camp. He's been watching us for days." Sarah's heart pounded as she crested the ridge and saw the hunting party spread out in a small clearing below. They had found Kempwash's hiding place, a carefully concealed camp tucked among large boulders where he could observe the settlement without being seen. But, thankfully, terrifyingly, there was no sign of Kempwash himself. Tom Miller stood in the center of the clearing, holding up items he had obviously taken from the abandoned camp. Even from a distance, Sarah could see a water gourd, some dried fish, and what appeared to be medicinal herbs. "This proves it," Miller announced to his men. "He's been spying on us, planning an attack. Look at these supplies." He was preparing for a long siege. Sarah wanted to scream that they were wrong, that the supplies were simply what any person would need to survive in the wilderness, while keeping watch over people he was trying to help. But she was outnumbered 20-1 by armed men whose fear had overcome their reason. One of the hunters, a young man Sarah recognized from the settlement, pointed toward a game trail leading deeper into the forest. "Fresh tracks heading that way. He can't be far." As the hunting party began to organize for pursuit, Sarah realized she had to do something desperate. If they caught up with Kintwash, they would kill him without question. Her only chance to save him was to create a distraction that would give him time to escape. Taking a deep breath, Sarah stepped out from behind the trees and called down to the men below. "Mr. Miller, what are you doing here?" The entire hunting party spun around to stare at her in amazement. Sarah began making her way down the slope toward them, forcing herself to appear calm and confused rather than panicked. "Miss Mitchell," Miller called back. "What in blazes are you doing out here? It's dangerous." "I was checking the water source where the contamination began," Sarah replied, thinking quickly. "I want to make sure it was properly cleaned. I heard shouting and thought someone might be hurt." She reached the clearing and looked around with what she hoped appeared to be innocent curiosity. "What is all this?" "This is an Indian camp," Miller explained, still holding the items he had taken. "We've been hunting the savage who's been spying on our town. He was here, but he got away." Sarah examined the camp with professional interest, noting details that supported her growing understanding of who Kintwash really was. The camp was meticulously clean and organized, located to provide strategic observation while minimizing environmental impact. This was not the hideout of a savage planning violence, but the temporary shelter of someone conducting careful surveillance for protective purposes. "How interesting," she said, picking up one of the bundles of herbs Miller had discarded. "These are medicinal plants. Willow bark for fever, echinacea for infection, sage for purification. Whoever was here has considerable knowledge of healing." "What are you suggesting?" one of the younger hunters asked suspiciously. "I'm not suggesting anything," Sarah replied carefully. "I'm simply observing that these supplies don't indicate hostile intent. They suggest someone with medical knowledge who might have been studying the outbreak." The men exchanged uneasy glances. Sarah could see doubt creeping into some of their faces, but Miller's expression remained hard and suspicious. "You seem to know an awful lot about Indian medicine," he said slowly. "Makes a man wonder how you learn such things." The implicit accusation in his voice sent a chill down Sarah's spine. She realized she was walking into exactly the trap Kintwash had warned her about. By defending him, even indirectly, she was making herself suspect in the eyes of people desperate to find someone to blame. "I'm a medical professional, Mr. Miller," she said with as much dignity as she could muster. "It's my job to understand different approaches to healing. In my training, I've studied various folk remedies, including those used by native peoples." It was a reasonable explanation, but she could see it wasn't entirely convincing Miller. His eyes narrowed as he studied her face, looking for signs of deception. "Mighty convenient that you happened to wander up here just as we were closing in on our quarry," he said. "Almost like you knew we'd find this place." Before Sarah could respond, another hunter called out from the edge of the clearing. "Tom, over here. You need to see this." The man was standing beside a large pine tree, pointing at something carved into its bark. As the group gathered around, Sarah felt her blood turn to ice. Carved into the tree was a simple symbol, two parallel lines crossed by a third, creating a pattern that looked almost like a medical cross. "What do you make of this?" Miller asked Sarah, his voice heavy with suspicion. Sarah stared at the carving, her mind racing. She had never seen Kintwash make this mark, had no idea what it meant. But the way Miller was looking at her suggested he thought she should know. "I have no idea," she said honestly. "It could be a territorial marker, a religious symbol, or simply random scratches made by an animal. Or it could be a signal," Miller said slowly. "A way for spies to communicate with their contacts in town." The accusation hit Sarah like a physical blow. She realized that no matter what she said, Miller had already decided she was somehow involved with the Indian they were hunting. The careful neutrality she had tried to maintain was crumbling, and she was running out of options. Mr. Miller, she said with desperate firmness, I am a traveling nurse who came here to help sick children. I have no connection to any Indians, no knowledge of their activities, and no agenda beyond saving lives. If you choose to see conspiracy in my medical knowledge and professional curiosity, that says more about your state of mind than mine. For a moment, the clearing fell silent except for the wind through the trees. Sarah could see the men weighing her words, some looking uncertain while others remained suspicious. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with her fate and possibly Kinpwash's hanging in the balance. Then a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. Let her go. I am the one you seek. Every man in the clearing spun toward the sound, weapons raised. Kinpwash stood at the edge of the forest, hands empty and visible, but somehow managing to look more dangerous than all of Miller's men combined. His dark eyes found Sarah's across the clearing, and she saw both resignation and determination in his gaze. No, Sarah whispered, understanding immediately what he was doing. He was sacrificing himself to save her from the consequences of helping him. I am Kinpwash, called Captain Jack by your people, he said, walking slowly into the clearing. I have been watching your settlement, not to plan attack, but to understand the sickness that kills your children. Miller's rifle was trained on Kinpwash's chest, but his voice shook with excitement rather than fear. Well, Captain Jack himself. Boys, we just caught ourselves the biggest prize on the frontier. Wait, Sarah said desperately, stepping between Miller and Kinpwash. Before you do something you'll regret, listen to what he has to say. Sarah, no, Kinpwash said quietly. You cannot help me now. Go back to your people and continue your healing work. But Sarah stood her ground, facing down 20 armed men with nothing but her courage and her conviction. This man saved my life when my stagecoach broke down. He guided me safely to Cedar Ridge so I could bring medicine to your children. He discovered the dead deer that was contaminating your water supply and tried to clean it up. He has done nothing but help, and you want to kill him for it. The silence that followed her declaration was deafening. Sarah could see the shock and confusion on the faces around her as they processed what she was saying. Some of the men looked uncertain, while others appeared angry at what they saw as a betrayal. Miller's face had turned red with rage. You traveled with this savage? You let him touch you, guide you? Do you have any idea what kind of danger you put yourself in? What kind of danger you put all of us in? The only danger came from ignorance and prejudice, Sarah shot back, her own anger finally breaking free. This man has shown me more honor and respect than most white men I've encountered. He risked his life to help me help you, and this is how you repay him. She's been bewitched, one of the younger hunters muttered. Indians got their ways of controlling white women's minds. The ugly implication in his words made Sarah feel sick, but it also crystallized her resolve. These men would never listen to reason, would never see past their own fear and hatred. The only way to save Kinpwash was to get him away from here, and that meant abandoning any pretense of neutrality. If you want to arrest him, Sarah said clearly, you'll have to arrest me too. We're traveling together, and we'll leave together. Miller stared at her in disbelief. You'd choose this savage over your own people? I choose decency over prejudice, Sarah replied. I choose someone who has shown me kindness over people who plan murder based on fear. The confrontation was interrupted by the sound of approaching horses. Through the trees, Sarah could see more riders coming toward the clearing, but these weren't townspeople from Cedar Ridge. They wore different clothes, carried different weapons, and moved with the confident authority of professional soldiers. Cavalry, one of Miller's men whispered nervously. As the soldiers entered the clearing, their leader, a captain by his insignia, surveyed the scene with sharp, intelligent eyes. Sarah noticed that his gaze lingered longest on Kinpwash, and there was something in his expression that seemed more like recognition than surprise. Gentlemen, the captain said in a voice that carried absolute authority, I'm Captain Reynolds of the 3rd Cavalry. We received reports of unauthorized vigilante activity in this area. Miller stepped forward, his rifle still trained on Kinpwash. Captain, we've caught ourselves the Indian who's been terrorizing our settlement. This here's Captain Jack himself. Captain Reynolds dismounted and approached Kinpwash with careful respect. Mr. Kinpwash, he said formally, I believe we have some business to discuss. The familiarity in his tone surprised everyone except, apparently, Kinpwash himself. Sarah saw her companion nod slightly, as if acknowledging some prearranged meeting. What business? Miller demanded. This savage needs to be hanged for what he's done. What exactly has he done? Captain Reynolds asked mildly. I've received reports that someone helped clean up a contaminated water source near your settlement, and that a qualified nurse was guided safely through dangerous territory to provide medical assistance during your outbreak. Are these the crimes you're referring to? The question hit the vigilantes like a slap. Sarah realized that Captain Reynolds knew far more about the situation than anyone had expected, and that his arrival wasn't the coincidence it had initially appeared to be. How do you know all that? Sarah asked. Captain Reynolds smiled slightly. Because Mr. Kimpwash has been working as a scout for the Army, helping us track and prevent real threats to frontier settlements. His observation of Cedar Ridge was conducted at our request to determine whether reports of Indian raids in this area had any substance. The revelation stunned everyone in the clearing. Sarah stared at Kimpwash, seeing him in an entirely new light, while Miller and his men looked as if their entire worldview had just collapsed. You're telling us he's working for the government? Miller asked weakly. I'm telling you that Mr. Kimpwash has probably done more to keep your families safe than any of you realize, Captain Reynolds replied firmly, and that threatening him or the nurse he was assigned to protect constitutes interference with official Army business. The captain's words transformed the entire dynamic of the confrontation. Miller's men began lowering their weapons, looking embarrassed and confused. The righteous anger that had driven them into the forest was deflating like a punctured balloon. But Sarah found herself focusing on one particular phrase the captain had used. Assigned to protect? She asked. Captain Reynolds nodded. When we learned that a medical professional would be traveling through this area during a possible outbreak, we arranged for Mr. Kimpwash to ensure her safe passage. His knowledge of the terrain and his ability to move unseen made him the ideal choice for the mission. Sarah looked at Kimpwash with new understanding, remembering their first encounter in the forest. His appearance hadn't been coincidence. He had been watching for her,